I want to take a slightly more academic, if I may, since we're in an academic institution, approach to presenting the report. I'll spend a little time later on the actual details that we present about the Jerusalem economy. But here, I'd like to begin by taking a few steps back and mentioning some of the things that perhaps we couldn't, as a United Nations agency, go into in any depth in this report, partly because of political constraints. We are an agency which specifically our unit on Palestine is specifically charged with looking at the occupied territory, the Palestinian economy in the occupied territory. So other deeper, wider issues we sometimes have to skirt around, such as the Palestinian economy in Israel, which I'd like to bring into the discussion today when we talk about Jerusalem, because I think that it's perhaps best understood. Jerusalem is best understood by a certain from a comparative angle, as well as trying to understand the specifics. So there are three wide-angled, if you wish, views that I think we need to keep in mind when looking at any Palestinian economic situation or issue under occupation. We in the UN are partly guilty for a certain reductionism and into simple and very, very well-known words, what is otherwise extremely complex and often hard to understand, at least to agree on how to understand an issue. So, words like occupation are very often overused and sometimes lose their meaning. So I want to try and give a few introductory points that I think we need to think about when looking at Jerusalem or looking at any other Palestinian experience, economic development experience. The first angle is that of history. And now, before looking specifically or talking specifically about Jerusalem, more the history, economic history of Palestine. If we go 70 years back, 1944, the last statistics of Mandate Palestine, there was, of course, in 44 an Arab-Jewish population ratio of approximately 60 to 40, Arab to Jewish, with an Arab-Jewish gross domestic product ratio which was inversed. So 60%, 40-60, more or less. 60% of the population produced 40% of the national income, 40% of the population produced 60% of the national income. Today, these are very rough figures, but this is the trend. We, of course, have a population ratio which is not yet equal, but will soon be. It's approximately 48-52. And if you look at the total GDP, or GNP, sorry, of the whole area that is under Israeli sovereignty, and all of which, of course, works with the same rules, the same economic system, the same international trade rules, the same monetary and macroeconomic framework, regardless of the different applications in different areas of this historic piece of land called Palestine, under which is all under Israeli sovereignty. Of course, the population ratio of 48-52 is mirrored by a GDP ratio of 12 to 88. So it means that 48% of the population produce now only 12% of the total national income, whereas 52%, or half of the population maybe, produce almost 90%. And for me, as an economist, as a development economist, as a Palestinian development expert, for me that is the challenge. How do you get back? How do you reverse that extraordinary decline over 60 years in what is effectively still an Arab/Jewish economy? Right? We have one system in which you have primarily a Jewish Israeli economy, and then you have a scattering of Palestinian Arab economies. So history is the historic sort of angle is the first thing that guides us in our work, at least. Geography is the second thing I think we need to keep in mind. In the pre-48 situation, there were no geographic boundaries between these economies. They were interlinked all over throughout the country. There were perhaps geographic boundaries between Jewish settlements and Palestinian towns, but the economy as such was not segregated, separated, or fragmented in any way. And it was described at the time, for better or for worse, by the term dual economy. The dualism being an advanced Jewish industrializing economy, hence the 60% of GNP, and a still agrarian Palestinian Arab economy. Today, we have, well, and I'll come back to this, something like 5 or 7 Palestinian economies that are coexisting with the dominant Israeli economy in this one geographic area. The third angle, and this is specifically something that is very difficult in the United Nations context to go into, because we've sort of abandoned it. I mean, the United Nations has abandoned the idea of colonialism or colonization and decolonization, though there is still a committee, I believe, in the United Nations on decolonization. The concept is not applied in the Palestinian context. It was, I think, originally in the 60s and the 70s, and prior to that, it was even, you'll find it in UN resolutions and in UN reports. But the concept, or the reality, I would say, that here we are facing yet a very special, a very unique case of settler colonialism and a confrontation with that settler colonialism, I think, is something you cannot escape any longer the analysis of anybody trying to seriously understand. I mean, what is going on, be it in Jerusalem or in any other part of the country. And these dynamics include several forces. There's an ongoing process of exclusion, which has led in most of these Arab economies to impoverishment. There's an ongoing process of exclaving, what has been called by a Palestinian geographer, Ghazi Falah, as exclavation, as opposed to enclavation. So basically, this is a process whereby Jewish settlements begin as enclaves within a sea of Arab land or villages. We've seen this in the Galilee. And over a period of 30, 40 years, the Arab villages become the enclaves, and the Jewish residential or economic or other presence has become the exclave, so to speak. The third essential dynamic of settler colonial dynamic that the Palestinians must confront is the labor market fragmentation. So again, Palestinian labor markets exist in different areas, serving partially their own economies, but largely linked in one way or another to the dominant Israeli economy. And in the north, if any of you have been early in the morning, drive north at 5:30 in the morning, leave the road 6, go towards Haifa, and see the torrent of cars, masses of Arab workers moving from the Nazareth area, moving south to their places of work in Tel Aviv, etc. That's one form of the fragmentation. In the West Bank, we have others, and in Jerusalem, we have yet another. Another aspect of this confrontation is of the process of settler colonialism and how it's affected the economies is, of course, the extraction of resources, and goes from all sorts of areas. I mean, there's the natural resources, there's the gas now, the Dead Sea. So there's the natural resources, but of course there's the human resources and the manner in which labor forces have been used and then more or less left aside. I mean, or even specific economic branches in the Hebron area, for example, were very closely linked for many years to Israeli subcontractors, or they were subcontracting for Israeli companies. As the Israeli economy modernized, liberalized, globalized, these branches were no longer profitable in Israel, and so it was no longer necessary to continue these industries died basically after what could have been extracted from them was extracted. So ultimately this all leads to an absorption in one form or another of the indigenous economy. Now Jerusalem basically is no stranger, unfortunately, to these trends. We've focused on the three the three subtitles of our report of annexation, isolation, and disintegration as the main features of the challenge, if you wish, faced by the Jerusalem economy. Challenge which has basically left it in what we call a sort of a developmental limbo, neither here nor there. Neither part of the Israeli economy nor part of the Palestinian economy, neither linked to, through tourism in particular, the global economy, but really not integrated into it. And this development limbo is, if you wish, is it's different than it's a very special version of the Palestinian development experience that we haven't necessarily seen in the West Bank or in Gaza. Things move one way or the other in those areas in a manner, at least, that one can track a path of development, quote unquote. Whereas in Jerusalem, it's much more that the economy has been left hanging as it gradually sheds its own indigenous or its own autonomous assets. So the report, of course, tries to first look at the very unique place of Jerusalem in Palestinian world history. We know its centrality. There's only one Jerusalem. I think Adnan Hussein said it yesterday in the press conference. There's only one Jerusalem in the world, so we know why that is so special and what it means in terms of not only the Palestinians and Muslims, but Christianity and Judaism. It had, of course, a moment when it was the capital of Palestine, of a united Palestine, under the British, nevertheless. An especially important aspect of Jerusalem that, again, does not apply to the other parts of the Palestinian economy is the partition resolution, insofar as the partition resolution designated that Jerusalem should be a corpus separatum under a special international regime, with the United Nations Trusteeship Council charted or given the task of administering the city and conducting its external affairs. Even after the acceptance of the State of Israel, the entry of the State of Israel into the United Nations, requested the Trusteeship Council to actually prepare for administering Jerusalem on the lines of that resolution. And in 1950, 3 years after the partition resolution, 2 years after the establishment of the State of Israel, the Trusteeship Council actually approved the statute, what it was called, for the city of Jerusalem, along those principles. So, since then, we know that perhaps at the time and subsequently there was no way that resolution could ever be implemented. However, the United Nations continues, in fact, it's yet another committee, the Trusteeship Council, continues to meet every year, opens its session. What's on the agenda? The remaining item on its agenda is Jerusalem. Any news? No news, we close the agenda. So, that's one of the quirks of the United Nations, but I, having worked there for 30 years, actually believe in the importance of this sort of legitimacy, this sort of international framework for any of the Palestinian problems that we face. And I don't think that time necessarily makes everything outdated or redundant. As early as 1967, the UN and the Security Council rejected Israel's occupation and annexation. Since then, of course, the resolutions have affirmed the illegality of the occupation and called for Israel's withdrawal. In particular, Security Council Resolution 476 in 1980, which of course was a unanimous resolution, very explicitly said that all legislative and administrative measures and actions taken by the occupying power which purported to alter the geographic, demographic, and historical character and status of the holy city of Jerusalem had no legal validity and were null and void. And I'd like to draw your attention to that very, very important concept, the holy city of Jerusalem. Now, the holy city of Jerusalem is not just the old city. It's not just East Jerusalem. The holy city of Jerusalem is the holy city of Jerusalem as specified in Resolution 181, namely west, east, north, and south. In fact, the holy city of Jerusalem goes from Shafat to Beit Lahem. So, for the moment, despite nothing having been implemented, and despite the fact that in the Israeli-Palestinian Accords of Oslo, Camp David as well, of course, Jerusalem is one of those famous permanent status issues. A final agreement was elusive. However, after 45 years of annexation, the only internationally agreed, and it remains an internationally agreed, at least at the time, vision for the city of Jerusalem and for its pending status remains the frame of reference of Resolution 181. So, to begin with, Jerusalem's specificity, notwithstanding the similarities that I touched upon at the beginning with other Palestinian experiences, but its specificities derive in particular from its very special legal status. Another important aspect of its, not only its specificities, but also of the specific challenge that is faced here in Jerusalem as opposed to elsewhere, economically speaking, is of course the physical and demographic segregation of Jerusalem from the west and from its east. So we know, of course, the problems regarding permanent status or residency status that Palestinian Jerusalemites have to be concerned with while they have the right to work, of course, and live in Israel. That permanent residency status is something that has to be very, very, very bitterly and jealously guarded, and by all sorts of means. People that those that you know, I'm sure know Palestinian Jerusalemites who have to maintain a residence. They have to maintain their clothes in the closets to show that they live in this house, etc., etc., etc. They can't send their children to school in Ramallah because they have to show that they pay school fees here, and so on and so forth. So the residency issue is an extraordinarily important constraint and a major one in terms of population, of course, growth, natural population growth. Approximately, it's estimated that approximately 14,000 Jerusalemites have lost their residency permits between 67 and 94, leaving in 2010 around 362 Jerusalemites, of whom, we estimate 282,000 live inside the barrier. There are other estimates. I think this is an Israeli Israeli Central Bureau of Statistics number. The Palestinian Central Bureau of Statistics, I think, puts the number at something like 264, and I think that's to 264,000. So anyhow, that's not a major difference. It's to do with perhaps definition of where the wall is and other different methodologies, etc. So this separateness, which begins with a separateness in terms of individual civil status, continues, of course, in the areas of housing and employment, in terms of the of access to services, in terms of course, the whole relationship of the citizen with the state, the taxes that Palestinians pay compared to the services that the Palestinian neighborhoods receive. Palestinian neighborhoods in Jerusalem host 30% of the city's population, and they received 7% of the municipal budget in 2009. So these sort of policies have effectively impeded, if nothing else, natural growth of the population. Whereas we know, of course, that in the smallest settlement in the West Bank, natural growth is the supposed reason to allow continued building. The segregation strategies, and we use this word very clearly and without any problem, even though those of you that might have seen Yediot Ahronot, they quoted us as saying that the United Nations says that Israel is strangling the Jerusalem economy. We didn't use that word, but we did refer to segregation strategies, which have become, of course, much more pervasive in the last decade through all sorts of measures that have altered the physical and demographic realities of the city. Land expropriation, expansion of Jewish settlements, the settler transport infrastructure, which cuts through Palestinian suburbs. I mean, and it's extraordinary. I don't live here. I come regularly. Of course, you all saw the building of the tramway. The other day, I now learned that if those of you who come from Hizma into Jerusalem, when you come up and you want to go left to go into Jerusalem, you can also go up the hill into Beit Hanina, which was really one of the segregated, if you wish, Arab neighborhoods. It's now become, I'm told, there's a huge road that's been cut through that takes you through, well, it takes people who are working in Piskat Zaiv or wherever, Israelis living in Jerusalem, straight through Beit Hanina, which is, I mean, another example of this cutting and segregating of the even in the smallest area of Jerusalem. The barrier, of course, the separation barrier, redefined the borders away from the pre-67 internationally recognized armistice line. Only 13% of East Jerusalem is designated for housing for Palestinians, as compared to triple that area designated for Israeli settlers. Today, there are around 200,000 settlers living in 16 settlements and suburbs, which is a nice word, within the barrier by 2010, a population almost as large as the Palestinian population of the city. 55,000 Jerusalemites, a fifth of the Palestinian Jerusalemite population, physically separated from the city center as a result of the barrier, living within the municipality and paying municipal taxes, but not enjoying most of the services that we all take for granted. Of course, access and freedom of movement, this physical segregation has immediate economic implications in terms of movement of goods and people. It's basically accelerated the disengagement of the West Bank residents from East Jerusalem markets, as compared to the 90s, where at least the flow was moving normally in both ways, and it's furthered this internal market disarticulation. Shrinking demand from Palestinian consumers has been a major factor in closure of estimated 280 shops in East Jerusalem since 1997, 50 in the old city alone, while others close and reopen, trading different products in line with changing demand. East Jerusalem, on the other hand, lost access to relatively cheaper products from the West Bank due to restrictions on movement, as well as marketing opportunities lost to East Jerusalem producers, given the tight restriction on the entry of Palestinians who live in the rest of the territories, and who used to be an important component of demand for East Jerusalem goods and services. It's estimated that the barrier incurred since 2002 or by 2010 approximately $1 billion of losses to the Jerusalem economy, and those are recurrent now at an annual rate of around $200 million. The Jerusalem economy, we estimate, it produces approximately 600 million, I mean, its GDP, if you wish, is approximately $600 million. Now, one of the most significant indicators of what's happened to Jerusalem, or of how its significance and the annexation and the isolation have impacted the economy is one of an overall trend, macroeconomic trend of decline and isolation and eventual dysfunctioning. Just as the economic growth pattern of Gaza has veered in a very separate direction from the rest of the occupied territories in the last 5 or 6 years, so has the economy of East Jerusalem diverged from that of the West Bank, effectively undermining the notion that the OPT, including East Jerusalem, are a single territorial and legal entity. East Jerusalem's share of Palestinian GDP was estimated, we estimated at UNCTAD in the 1980s, just on the eve of the Intifada, at around 15% of the total Palestinian GDP. By the mid-1990s, it had already fallen to 8%. Today, it's well under 7%. So we're talking about a halving of its productive capacity in 20 years. And a relative insignificance. This is the capital city of the state intended to be the capital city of the state of Palestine. It is the largest Palestinian urban center, and it's on a downward trend, which basically, if not halted, will continue to render it absolutely insignificant. The East Jerusalem economy is integrated neither into the Palestinian economy nor into the Israeli economy. On the one hand, it's structurally dependent on the West Bank to sustain production, trade, and employment, but it's forcibly dependent on Israeli markets to whose regulations and systems it has to conform, and which serve as a source of employment and trade, as well as the principal channel for tourism to the city. So if we look at we do look at the performance of the economy in the 1990s and then in the 2000s. The numbers, the data for the 2000 period are not as good as the data that we have for the 1990 period. But the important point that we can derive from looking at what does exist is the very perverse nature of the so-called peace dividend that was supposed to come with Oslo. Per capita GDP during the 90s grew by an annual average, until the eve of the Second Intifada, an annual average of around 2% in the rest of the West Bank. Per capita GDP growth in Jerusalem was stagnant over the period. Real GDP of Jerusalem has increased by small increments since 2001, but as I mentioned, its relative size has fallen because that growth was not as good as, has lagged behind that of the remaining West Bank and Gaza Strip, which itself only began to recover starting in 2007 and 8. Some indicators would suggest, on the face of them, a higher standard of living in Jerusalem compared to the remaining West Bank. Per capita GDP in Jerusalem was estimated at $1,360 in 2002, compared to $1,200 in the remaining West Bank. Similarly, our average monthly household consumption in Jerusalem is higher than in the rest of the OPT. But such apparent advantages should not be mistaken for real developmental or welfare gains, as we'll hopefully conclude from continuing to look at the rest of the picture. On the microeconomic level, we have a story of survival. And this is, perhaps the hopeful part of what we can say about Jerusalem. There has been, a survival of the economy. There is an economy there, but it's gradually disintegrating. The services sector, of course, remains the largest sector in both the East Jerusalem and the remaining Palestinian territory, contributing on an average a quarter of the GDP in the rest of the OPT, but as much as 40% in Jerusalem. Some other economic sectors contributed in a similar manner to the GDP in both East Jerusalem and the West Bank, and others have differential roles. Of course, hotel and restaurant activities are less significant in the rest of the Palestinian territories as compared to Jerusalem. Transportation, no surprise, has a higher weight in the economy of Jerusalem than that of the West Bank because of what we know about the need for transportation, transport contiguity. Similarly, construction, because of the boom, has a much greater weight in the west of West Bank than in Jerusalem, where we know about all the restrictions on building. In addition, of course, Palestinian households in Jerusalem face impediments related to access to finance and credit, be it for consumption, investment, or housing, all of which is compounded by the particularly high prices in Jerusalem, given that they're part of an economy, or in an economy in which price levels are in many areas higher than the West Bank. And the problem on finance is not just the lack of bank branches, which is a problem, of course, but Palestinians will naturally avoid relying on Israeli banks for mortgages, which can lead to takeover of property, for business financing, for transfers, and instead they try to use Palestinian banks operating outside the barrier, but those, on the other hand, don't accept real estate guarantees from Jerusalemites. So again, this limbo issue we see it in so many different sectors, at least being stuck between a rock and a hard place. Deposits of Jerusalemites in Palestinian banks in the West Bank amount to around $200 million. But as I said, you cannot get a housing loan unless you're living in J2, the area of Jerusalem outside the wall. So paradoxically, we're going to see perhaps a housing boom outside the barrier while the neighbors inside the barrier continue to languish. So really, the Jerusalem economy since 2001 has been left to fend for itself and to try to maintain its integrity. It is to attempt to preserve its deep roots in the hinterland economy. And the hinterland economy is not just the West Bank. Don't forget that this was part of Jordan until 1967, and in fact the tourism industry, if you talk to people in the tourism industry, they'll tell you that the tourism infrastructure in 1967 was well advanced comparatively to what it is today. And we've referred to some of that in the report because we did a study on tourism in 1991, so we had some interesting information to give. So you have these strong integrative forces of adaptation to the Israeli regulatory framework and exchange with the Israeli economy, which exert a very powerful pull on Jerusalemites to conform and to acquiesce under Israeli rule. On the other hand, we have the historical links, social, political, and economic with the West Bank, which unfortunately I don't think anybody is making much of an effort to actively try and maintain. That which still exists more out of necessity than out of intention. Another distinctive aspect of Jerusalem's economy is the extremely severe, alarmingly severe rates of poverty. Higher, and here, this is one area where I think, it's absolutely important to make comparisons with Israelis, not with other Palestinians, because nominally this is a city under Israeli administration, and in principle the services for all residents should be equivalent. And I think the higher unemployment rates and the higher poverty rates, in particular among Palestinian Jerusalemites compared to Israelis residing in the city, attest to their marginalization within the Israeli economy and to the simultaneous separation from trends in the rest of the West Bank. This is yet another feature of the limbo. Unemployment, of course, was very high in the early 2000s as the Intifada and then the barrier took effect. It's gone down, of course, but only and it's stuck now at over 12,000. Closer to the unemployment rates of the minority populations in Israel, the Arab Israelis and the religious Jewish population, and in fact, nevertheless less severe than unemployment in the rest of the West Bank. That is especially because of labor flows to Israel. Around 35% of the Jerusalem economy, of the Jerusalem labor force, work in Israel or in the settlements or in West Jerusalem, serving in a sense as a valve, which is inaccessible to other Palestinians and prevents higher unemployment. And, it's one of the, I think any Palestinian from Jerusalem who has friends in Ramallah, they all make jokes about Jerusalemites, they have national insurance and they have all of these privileges that they don't have in the West Bank. But, I think it works both ways, is the deprivation. Jerusalem has always, of course, exercised a very strong pull on Palestinian job seekers, both from different regions of the West Bank, both before and after occupation, but from many regions of the West Bank. Palestinian agrarian populations from the surrounding region, especially, we know, Hebron, has looked to Jerusalem as an alternative to limited and increasingly limited rural opportunities. And indeed, and you're hearing it from a Jerusalemite Khalidi, this rural urban migration has, I think, above all, sustained the Palestinian Arab character of East Jerusalem in the last 40 years. The higher wages of workers in Israel, of course, have exerted upward pressure on wages in East Jerusalem, increasing the labor cost to Palestinian producers despite low productivity, which in turn undermines the competitiveness of East Jerusalem products and services, which are increasingly being substituted with imports, mainly from Israel. Palestinians form about 30% of the total population of the city, but they constitute 43% of the unskilled labor force. They face the same cost of living and market conditions as Israelis in Jerusalem, but the average monthly wage for East Jerusalem Palestinians working in Israel was around 4,000 shekels in 2009, less than half the average in Israel, 8,100 shekels. Most importantly, the poverty rate in Jerusalem. I cannot explain it, to be honest. How, but it must be the case. And this is Israeli statistics. 77% of non-Jewish households in Jerusalem were living under the Israeli poverty line. 77. That means 3 in 4 Palestinian families are poor in Jerusalem, compared to 25% of Israeli households. Now, we know that the Israeli Orthodox population shares the same sort of characteristics in terms of poverty, etc., as Palestinians. But even there, we can see the extraordinary disparity. 84% of Palestinian children, 84% of Palestinian children, because of course the 77%, they have big families, so they're mainly children, so 84% of Palestinian children were classified as poor in comparison to 45% of Jewish children in the city. Palestinians, again, are a third of the population, but they have 3 welfare officers working for them, serving them in Jerusalem, compared to 18 serving Israelis. We talk, and I won't mention much here, about the social fabric, which is at risk, and which is, we're economists, true, and we We're development economists, but we appreciate, and I think we see absolutely the need to look at the broader picture, and that broader picture, when you look at health services or if you look at education, is no less dismal than the economic situation. For example, and I'll just throw out a couple of the numbers. In the academic year 2007-8, there was a shortage of at least 1,000 classrooms in East Jerusalem at all levels, and only 250 classrooms had been added since 2001. Half of East Jerusalem classrooms, 700 classrooms, were classified as substandard in 2009. 221 of them were housed in unfit buildings. 5,000 Palestinian school-age children are not enrolled in any institution. Israeli West Jerusalem has a 7.4 dropout rate. In East Jerusalem, the rate is 50%. Lack of recreational and cultural services and outlets. West Jerusalem has 1,000 public parks. There are 45 in East Jerusalem. 34 swimming pools in the west, 3 in the east. 26 public libraries in West Jerusalem, 2 in East Jerusalem. 531 sports facilities, 33 in East Jerusalem. Budget allocation in East Jerusalem per student, 577 shekels. 1/4 the per student budget allocation in West Jerusalem. Now, there's a very short section in the report on the Old City, which I think really we all know is really at the heart of the East Jerusalem economy. It's not only at the heart of the survival of that economy, but I believe it's at the heart of its future. It's its greatest potential strategic asset. The Old City, its medieval Arab Islamic cultural heritage. As we know, a significant proportion of the residential and commercial property in the Old City is owned by Islamic private endowments, awqaf, managed for centuries by families or by public charitable institutions. 2,400 economic establishments in the Old City, of which 200 are manufacturing or other crafts, 2,000 of which are commercial properties, around half of which traded in tourist goods, foodstuffs, restaurants, and various services. There's a very small number of manufacturing workshops in the Old City, micro-enterprises, sometimes producing for sale to tourist shops, which is a long-standing but an increasingly fragile intersectoral linkage. Less than 10% of the commercial and manufacturing establishments in the Old City are Jewish-owned, which is, I think, an interesting number after 45 years. 6,000 families in the Old City in 5,600 housing units, numbering 40,600 people by 2010. The Jewish share of the Old City population rose in I think this is in the 2000s, from 8.6% to over 10%. And the pressure for Palestinian repopulation in the Old City to preserve and renew neglected properties or to safeguard residency status made the Palestinian population grow quite strongly to over 35,000 by 2010. And of course, this strong population growth constitutes an extremely strategically important counterweight to the limit, and that I think places effective limits on further Jewish settlement of the Old City. The resident population of the Old City composition has changed over time as more affluent Jerusalemites moved out to other areas of East Jerusalem, and lower income Jerusalemites from outside the barrier used that opportunity to move in. We have nevertheless an extraordinary duality in housing conditions and in socio-cultural services in the Old City, between Arabs, between Palestinians and Jews. Higher infant mortality, higher housing density. In 2002, 30% of dwellings were still not linked to the running water system. 40% were still unconnected to the sewage system, the dampness, inadequate garbage collection, sewage, drainage networks, and public spaces. So more than any other part of the Palestinian people in East Jerusalem, of which the Old City accounts for approximately 15% of the population, these Jerusalemites are caught between the front lines of interaction with Israeli settlers and authorities and the front lines of the struggle to preserve the Palestinian cultural and political identity and its Islamic Christian roots. There's a growing sense of siege and conflict for Palestinians living in the Old City. They perceive their lifestyles, their livelihoods, and their social cohesion to be at risk in this very discordant climate reigning in the Old City. We were reminded of that the other day, I believe. And it represents, in our view, an extreme case of the adverse and complex social and economic impacts of annexation without integration and with isolation and prolonged decline. And it also offers us a glimpse into the survival, coping, and adapting strategies to which Jerusalemites have resorted. They've been able to maintain a distinctive, if dependent and vulnerable, Arab economy at the heart of the old city's global market, while striving to maintain their links with their traditional historic economic hinterland. Now, there's a very short section in the report which is about what lessons from confronting settler colonialism. And I'd like to now come back to that, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about that, and then I'll conclude. And I think we need to understand, before we can do anything about Jerusalem, and people are saying, well, what we did, of course, journalists, they don't want to know too much about what I've just been talking about. They want to know what should be done. What are your recommendations? I don't want to talk too much about the recommendations. I don't believe we don't have a blueprint, and I don't think we should be looking to the United Nations for a blueprint in any case. But I think what we can do is help, not you only and us, but I think those that are eventually, hopefully, going to do something about Jerusalem, to understand exactly what it is that we face. What are the dynamics we face? This is not simply occupation. And I think that this is something we have to move beyond. We're not just talking about a military occupation that's there, and I mean, it goes much deeper than that. It's not simply denial of rights. And in a sense, I think the Palestinian people, be it here in Jerusalem or elsewhere, are not simply facing a force that is able to limit itself. The problem really is not the state of is not the question of the state of Israel and the state of Palestine. The question is how to decolonize, if you wish, lobotomize the colonization in the state of Israel. How can we, how can this state not be a colonial settler state? If we understand that at least is the challenge, I'm not saying that is something we can achieve, but if we understand that is the challenge, then how we deal with economic problems, the sort of solutions that we tried to bring would, I think, slightly be better, well, at least we'll be better informed. They might not work much better, but at least they'll be better informed. And this brings me to the title of this, which Mandy was not sure. She said, "You sure that's not a spelling mistake?" Because the Palestinian economy, what is it? In the peripheries. Okay, she said, why peripheries? I said, well, I'll explain why peripheries. So, Palestinian economies at the peripheries. You have, and this is coming back to what I said earlier, the 7. I said between 5 and 7, so you can take your choice. Basically, we have different groups of Palestinians now separated legally, physically, economically. I mean, each one is on their own trajectory. Each one is determined by a set of specific local forces. On the other hand, they all revolve within the orbit of one economic, political, legal force. You have at least 3 economies in the West Bank. At least 3. You have West Bank 1, which is the Ramallah model, if you wish, which has been especially powered in the last years by a strong trend, a strong strain of neoliberalism. In fact, pure neoliberalism, in the sense that this is the period of the last, since the PA split and the assumption of the Fayyad government since 2007, at a time when the world economy was undergoing a crisis, which any of you who read the New York Times will see from reading the most moderate of commentators like Paul Krugman, some very big mistakes were made, and some huge misconceptions about how economies were predominant and were driving the global economy. And I think that if nothing else, this crisis, the global crisis, has exposed those forces for what they really are. However, at that time, when while neoliberalism itself was and continues to be challenged globally and even in the region by the Arab uprisings, for some reason in Ramallah it took off and has I won't say has succeeded, but it certainly has been very widely bought into. We won't talk today about Palestinian neoliberalism, but it is clearly a model which is meant to to lead and is meant to inspire, and has in a certain geographic area of the West Bank succeeded for a certain group, strata of people. You have West Bank 2. Now, whereas the first model is really one of individual prosperity and communal impoverishment, West Bank 2 is, and I take Hebron, in fact, is the geographic center of that economy, where you have a strong communal cohesion and social fabric, which is the basis for a much broader socioeconomic steadfastness, sumud, and in fact a development. I mean, Khalil is the only. It's not only a power in the Palestinian economy. It's not only a powerhouse for Jerusalem. It actually has. It's an international economy. Khalilis have opened up factories in China. Jawal has made receiving calls in China free. So you can roam in China as if you're roaming in the rest of the West Bank, primarily because there are so many people who have succeeded in, well, Jerusalem and Hebron, you can, exactly. So I think it's an extraordinarily, and we know how the social fabric in that region is very strong, how family, the family basis of economic enterprise is also very strong. Entrepreneurial spirit is extraordinary, and I think it's a model which those of you that have followed the recent discussion about the I don't know if you've noticed, but there's been a Palestinian Authority decision to levy tariffs for the first time, to raise tariffs on imported goods from China. And there's a huge outcry, but the reason they're doing that is, in fact, it's the first time the Palestinian Authority has ever tried to protect its infant industries, and those infant industries are more than, it's clothes, it's basically textile, footwear, and furniture goods, basically, are the goods which are being protected, or the local production of which is being protected. So it's clear that West Bank 2 is an important model that we need to learn more about, and it's one of the things I'm looking forward to studying myself in the coming years. East Jerusalem, which we've talked about, and of course now we have the Gaza Strip. I mean, at least until 2007, we could talk about the West Bank and Gaza Strip in terms of one regulatory, economic, macro framework. We can no longer do that. Not only is it moving in a different direction, but it's ruled by a different political system. Its trade rules, its trade regime is changing basically on an ad hoc basis. So the government there is adopting different tariffs and different arrangements, and we know about the tunnel economy. So we have, I don't know if it's Islamic neoliberalism, maybe, is what we're going to see, just a sort of a halal brand of the sort of thing we've seen in Ramallah. I'm not sure, but again, it's clearly a new model. In the West Bank, you have the rest of the West Bank, which is perhaps West Bank 3. Area C, the famous Area C, which is perhaps not an economy as such, but we still have 150,000 odd Palestinians living there. And you have the North, which again, perhaps, I'm not sure, we need to look at it, but it's all part of the West Bank PA ruled economy. However, the way the economy functions, its relations with it. For example, the northern West Bank, unlike anywhere else in the rest of the West Bank, has a direct exchange on a daily basis with Palestinian Israelis in coming over the border for shopping, for services, for all sorts of things, which is something I think, not extraordinary, but it's one of those channels that we need to think about in the future. So you have these. Finally, you of course have the Palestinian Arab economy in Israel, which I've personally written quite a lot about over the years, and I think that again there's much to learn from that experience. It's been described by various sociologists and economists with different terms, any of which you could apply, I think, in one way or another to discussing any of the areas we've talked about. Internal colonialism is something that Ilya Zurey, many years ago, was the framework that he adopted to understand the socioeconomic status of Palestinians in Israel. I, in my work, being more of an economist and trying to remain economistic, have analyzed that economy, the Arab economy in Israel, as a regional economy in Israel. it's a useful frame of reference. Perhaps it's not conceptually very deep, but at least it helps us define what it is we're talking about. More recently, some very interesting work by some Israeli sociologists have talked about the same processes as partial inclusion. I think the best is probably, and the most interesting one, and in many ways it applies to Jerusalem, is incorporation without integration. And so you incorporate, you use, but you'd never integrate this other economy. So now, to conclude, why are they peripheral? Why do I say periphery? So really, what I think we need to start looking at is these regional economies, which are peripheral to the global economy. They're peripheral to the Arab regional economy. There's some links, but they're peripheral. And those economies are peripheral to the Palestinian economies. They're, however, linked, incorporated, but not integrated into the Israeli economy, they're peripheral to the Israeli economy. The Israeli economy goes ahead, it has its own path, it has its own resources, it extracts what it needs, it makes sure that the Arab economies under the Israeli economic regime are at least not completely so neglected that they become tinderboxes. However, there is no serious approach to or efforts to develop those economies. And we've studied the plans since the 1950s in Israel to development of the Arab sector and minority sector development plans, one after another, 5-year plans. Barak did a plan, and Netanyahu had a plan, and everybody has plans, and they're still coming up with plans because these plans are not really ever being implemented. So that I think that the Israeli policymaker realizes that there is an obligation even to do something about this. But because of the nature of the state, which is all of whose imperatives are geared to ensuring the successful integration of Jews from around the world and their settlement and their prosperity, needless to say, the rest of us come in second and third. And most importantly, they're peripheral to each other, these economies. And that's really, I think, where the solution begins, ultimately. The challenges that we face are multiple. In the West Bank, we need to think about how this extreme brand of Palestinian neoliberalism can be reversed, can be exposed, I would say, even for the limitations that are inherent to it, not as because it's neoliberal, but because it's an attempt to do something which might work in normal circumstances, but in a situation which, even with all of the facilitation that Palestinian Authority has had, claim to have had for the last 5 years from Israel in terms of this experiment, Rawabi, and the other, the financials markets that are developing, and the credit, private credit facilities that exist that didn't exist before, the cellulars, and all of those services which are permitted to that economy. Nevertheless, the events of last year, the September demonstrations, and the several reversals of policies which were adopted on taxes and on inflation and on VAT, which the government had to retract, I think are all indicative of the fact that these policies have reached their limits. So that's one area that needs to be worked on. In Gaza, of course, we have to somehow this economy has to be brought back to the rest of the Palestinian economy. How exactly, I'm not sure, but obviously within a situation of Palestinian national reconciliation, it cannot happen otherwise. But Gaza, given its I've used this before, don't quote me, it's somewhat less occupied than the rest of the Palestinian territory. It's still under occupation, but it has more degrees of freedom, let's say. It has potential in terms of trade with Egypt and through Egypt, which was reported, what was it, Nicholas Pelham, $700 million per annum, which is an extraordinary reversal of trade patterns that we haven't seen for 45 years. Whereas, in the West Bank, 90% of imports are from Israel or through Israel, and whatever 60-70% or to Israel, you have in Gaza, it's shown the potential. It's been a very distorted process. It's been done with a lot of corruption and a lot of irregularities. Nevertheless, I think it's revealed the potential there for relinking Palestinian economies to their Arab neighbors. So Gaza is the second challenge. Arabs in Israel, Palestinian Arabs in Israel, is another challenge, and I think we cannot, perhaps the United Nations cannot do much about it, but Palestinian policymakers certainly can do more. And I think this entails bridging the gaps between struggles that are underway there and have been underway for many years for national and civic rights on the one hand, and for socioeconomic advancement and the social struggle on the other hand. And that link has not yet been made. And I think that's part of I was in Haifa the other day speaking with two members of Knesset, and they both thought we need a national development plan for the Arabs. We need to engage even with the Mizrahim, with the religious forces that are also poor and that are also objecting to socioeconomic inequality and injustice in Israel. But they're having a problem in linking that to their national struggle. But that, I think, is a way forward for that part of the Palestinian economy. And I would add to that the absolute necessity to see what links exist. I've mentioned the sort of trade links that we have in the north of the West Bank. How can those be exploited? How can they be deepened? How can you have investment, Palestinian, Arab, Israeli investment inside the West Bank, vice versa perhaps? How can Palestinian middlemen in Israel help Palestinian traders rather than Palestinian traders having to rely on Israeli middlemen, etc.? Finally, of course, in East Jerusalem, coming back to East Jerusalem, we've used this very broad word, which has perhaps been abused, development cooperation. And I think that's really what we need, in the sense that it's not a question of the Arab and Gulf funds, which have not yet come and probably won't come, and nobody should wait for them to come, to be honest. If you go through the report, you're going to find a few very, we tried to stay away from it because had we wanted to go into it, you can imagine what I would have said. But we strayed away from that. The point is that basically there has been none. And whether or not something is coming, I think, is not what Palestinians need to focus on. What they need to focus, there are two areas which are essentially to do with cooperation and coordination, which, if you can't achieve that, you cannot really expect to do much. And there's one level is between the internationals themselves. The agencies, the UN, the NGOs, the donors. I don't want to open that discussion about donor relations with donors and all of the problems that we have, but it's clearly something that, in Jerusalem there's no room for competition, there's no room for territory, and there's no room for staking out agendas. The only agenda in Jerusalem has to be a Jerusalem agenda. It cannot be a donor agenda, it cannot be a UN agenda. But the Jerusalem agenda, it's there. I mean, we know what, I've talked about some of them, and if you talk to any of the NGOs or any of the local leaders, they'll come up with as many and many more suggestions than I can come up with. But until they are, the Palestinian Jerusalem institutions are able to form some sort of a coalition that can deal with these partners, and I would say also deal with the service providers. I mean, yesterday, when I presented this report, Azzam Abu Saud said, but you say in your report that the Palestinian local institutions should coordinate among themselves and with the donors and with the Israeli service providers. I know the political red lines, and I'm not trying to cross them. All I'm saying is that every single one of those 300,000 Palestinians living in Jerusalem on a daily basis is having to deal with those service providers, be it the municipality or the National Insurance Institute. And I don't think that you can, they can just be left to continue to do that and expect to preserve their presence and their viability in the city without support. And so somehow, we need to think of how, without getting into the much more sticky question of representation, how, perhaps through intermediaries, perhaps through international intermediaries, how somehow an agenda for dealing with these issues can be established. Because if you just leave it to the whims of Israeli authorities, you're not going to get anything. If you leave it to the willingness of the UN or the Quartet or anybody else to make a fuss about this or that, you might get occasional breakthroughs. So unless, you know, there is some sort of a mobilization, some sort of a coordinating, Palestinian coordinating body, then I can't see how any, you know, we have a 2010 proposals made by the Palestinian Authority, very good ones, in fact, and we've talked about them in the report, for, you know, the sort of allocations that are needed between tourism, the economy, housing, etc., based on proper studies within a fairly comprehensive framework, which are very useful, and we don't need much more studies. We didn't really need this report, I mean, but I think we needed it in order to focus a bit more the discussion, and because Jerusalem is, you know, even we in the UN, just as Gaza has sort of fallen off the map, the economic problems in Gaza and issues, so have the economic issues and challenges of Jerusalem fallen off our map, and the point of this report was to put it back on the map, and in doing so, I think we need to be thinking about not just East Jerusalem, but really rebuilding the Arab economy of Palestine. And that is a long-term process, which I'd be happy to help with. Thank you very much.